ahead and share yours while I read your introduction.
Oh, am I going first?
Yeah, Tony, you're up next.
Okay,
If you want to go ahead
no
and share your
problem. Yeah, I
screen.
will
Yeah.
do that.
All right, yeah. All right. So next up, we have Tony Lattis from University of Wisconsin-Madison presenting Migrating Legacy Data to ArchivesSpace, Lessons from a Migration Project at University of Wisconsin-Madison Archives and Records Management. This presentation will give an overview of a project to migrate legacy accession data into ArchivesSpace. In the fall of 2023, University of Wisconsin-Madison Archives executed a project to migrate a Microsoft Access database, which contained 40 plus years of accession records into ArchivesSpace. The project has greatly increased the usability of ArchivesSpace as a mode of discovery for archive staff. This presentation will describe the process as an example of successful legacy data migration. This project included the use of Python as a way to assemble JSON data for loading with the ArchivesSpace API. There should be plenty of time for questions and discussions of successes or failures with this type of migration, as well as prospective projects regardless of technical complexity. Turning it over to you, Tony.
All right, thanks a lot. So I want to talk about a migration project that I think and I'll talk about this in deeper context, but it emerged from a need to kind of simplify the work that we were doing around the department, but I think it really changed the way that we end up using ArchivesSpace at the end of the day. But I'll get to more of that as I get going. Who am I? I'm Tony Lattis. I'm a processing archivist at a large public university in the Midwestern United States. I've been in my position since about 2021. I'm not like a professional programmer, and I don't have any like CS background or anything like that. I have messed around with Python as a hobby for a few years now. But I don't really have many technical responsibilities in my job. So what I'm hoping to sort of bring is the perspective of an archivist who wanted to execute something like this. The project that I'm going to discuss here was executed in late 2023. I had sort of arrived at the idea in late 2022, but it took a while for it to sort of come to the top of my work queue. It involved the migration of about 9,000 accession records into ArchivesSpace, and largely was a product of a big Python script that I used to do all of this stuff. But again, I'll get into that more later. So really, since I don't have a huge amount of background with these types of projects, I sort of thought, well, what can I say about this project that would be meaningful? So I want to talk about why this was a good opportunity to migrate data, what like tools that I used, and what kind of skills you might need to do something similar, and a little bit about how I sort of decided on an approach to it. I also want to talk about what I kind of learned, what my more general takeaways for a project like this are, so that it would be useful for someone who's maybe not going to use the same software or tools at all, but wants to do a sort of similar project. And then I just wanted to touch on how this changed how we use ArchivesSpace, because I think ultimately it's had a large effect. Our institution was a sort of late adopter of ArchivesSpace, and this is had a pretty broad impact on how it's used around the department. So here's my roadmap for today. I'm going to do an overview of the sort of origin of the document that I ended up migrating and its context and the context of the project. I'll do a kind of brief summary of the technical elements of the project. I don't want to like show a ton of code or anything. I don't know what the audience here is like. If we want to talk about that more afterwards, I'd be happy to. But I'm not a professional programmer or anything like that, so I don't have that much to teach as far as that's concerned. Then I'll finish with some things that I think that I learned about migrating legacy data, and some things that I feel like you can take away. So here's my like super brief history of UW Archives. We were founded in 1950 and had pretty standard practices at that time. An important sort of era for me is in the early 70s when we started having separate typed accession records. by the 1980s, most processing had stopped at UW Archives. Things were being given an accession number and a location, and the titles associated with those were the primary method of description for archives collections. In 2000, UW Archives moved about a mile across campus to a satellite library from the central library on campus. This transition has never really been completed. We still have material that's over in the other library. So this obviously fragmented description and led to a lot of transition documents and stuff like that. It's just sort of an important piece of context for our institution. And then in 2018, we implemented ArchivesSpace. Since that time, we've tracked accessions through ArchivesSpace, but that was sort of a clean break. So we have data from before that time and then data from after that time. And then in 2022, we were approved to build a new shelving facility. So this means that we've been allocating a lot more resources towards doing processing, and has also led to me sort of reevaluating what our descriptive situation is like and how I want it to work going forward. So the big thing, the context for this project is sort of descriptive fragmentation. We have a guide for our reference staff to kind of guide them in how to look for collections at UW Archives. And that guide is fairly complex. It has 19 sections and it's covering various different descriptive resources. I'm sure a lot of people have similar situations to this. It's just really hard to get everything in one place, especially if your institution has a longer history. But like, you know, this feels a little difficult to me. And so this includes like large resources like our library's electronic catalog and some big card indexes that we have. And there's also a huge number of smaller resources, things like spreadsheets that, cover one format or maybe, one area or one era, Word documents that function as like subject guides or something of that nature. And then a Microsoft Access database, which I've called out specifically because that's the thing that I actually worked on for this project. This is, again, just some more context. You can sort of see this in the early years of UW Archives. This is what accession tracking looked like. You can see the entries down at the bottom in the grid of this card. Not much information there, not much specific information, I should say, although I like this card a lot because one of the titles here is History Can Be Interesting, which is a really strong thesis statement for your department, I think. This is one of the typed accession records that I was talking about before, which are important for me in this project. As you can see up at the top, that we actually have sequential accession numbers now. There's a lot more data going on here, some indication of where provenance is coming from, but still sorting things into repr groups the way that you would classically do it. Documentation of the actual event of transfer. So this is what ACMaster looked like. That was the title of this document. And ACMaster was really important for the functioning of UW Archives, both in terms of sort of technical function and reference service. It must have taken a lot of time to get this started, and it has a lot of drawbacks. But it has a ton of information in it, right? This is an accession register that goes back a long way. You can see on the left-hand side that these records that I'm showing are from 1977. So there was a ton of information here and a ton of access to collections at UW Archives, but having them in a Microsoft Access database like this made them a little bit difficult to deal with. So the sort of context for ACMaster, it was like I said, an access database. It was in use from sometime in the early 90s until about 2018. I shouldn't say about, because that's when ArchivesSpace was implemented and we started tracking accessions in there instead. I can't exactly pinpoint when it started, but I know that Microsoft Access came out in the early 90s. And also, if you're a keen-eyed viewer, you will note that ACMaster has 8 characters in it, which is indicative to me of a pre-Windows 95 file name. Maybe just a habit that carried over, I don't know. But that seems like a good guess for when it started. It has about 9,000 accession events in it. And the records go back to 1977. So if it started in the early 90s, but we have all these older records in it, it means that somebody went through and retroactively typed thousands of records into ActMaster. And I am profoundly thankful for that labor. This project would not have been possible without it. And I had to remind myself of that as I was going through and dealing with errors and ambiguities and stuff like that, that like, you know, having this made this thing possible. So my deepest thanks to whoever did this. I have no idea who you are. ActMaster was sort of an omnibus for our department. It was functioning both as an accession register, but also for like what you might consider resource information, like shelving locations, record groups, titles, that's up-to-date stuff like that, which meant that it played a pretty large role in the function of the department. We were having to keep this thing updated in parallel with other resources. It was also frequently used for discovery by reference staff. So they would do that, just by opening the document and using Control F, just a clunky, but, reasonable way to do something like this. But it has probably the broadest, I say probably because I'm not really confident in this statement about any of our discovery resources, but it probably has the broadest coverage of any document that we were using to sort of do title searches for collections at UW Archives. So it made a really, really good candidate for migration for these reasons. One, it was taking up a lot of time to keep it updated, and two, because there's a lot of pretty comprehensive coverage in there. So that's it for the context. I want to just give a short summary of the technical elements, kind of focusing on how things fit together rather than how they worked at any granular kind of level. The first step was just to dump ActMaster into an XLSX document. I knew that I would need to get the data out, do some manipulation on it, and then map it onto the ArchivesSpace record form. XLSX is not, there's no great reason to do it that way, other than that I was already confident that I could get the open PyXL library in Python to interact with an XLSX document. So like I could have used CSV or something flat, or maybe even figured out how to get Python to read an access database. I'm sure that's possible, but I didn't know how to do any of those things. And so as a sort of theme for this project, like it was just, what did I already know how to do? And I already knew how to do this, and also that would avoid common problems with CSV data. Then use a variety of original Python functions to translate and normalize the original data. This was sort of the bulk of the project, was coding for various situations that would occur within ActMaster. I chose to do it this way rather than use a tool like OpenRefine or something like that, because the sort of freedom to do arbitrary translation, I think, made things work faster. I wasn't having to learn how to use a different tool. I could try and fail and try again, and just sort of do things progressively. Then use Python's JSON library to assemble new accession records, and then use the archives snake extension for the API to load those records into ArchivesSpace. So that's the broad outline of how the project worked. For just some notes on working with the source data, I tried as a maxim to make as few edits directly to the source data as possible. In my mind, this sort of minimizes the assumptions that you make as the person doing the migration, as opposed to like accurately reflecting whatever assumptions happened in the source. I tried to be very respectful of the source for reasons that I can get into a little bit later. And then also maximize continuity, right? Just like try to make sure that what was in the original data ends up in the migrated data. Data largely normalized by tumble down logic. I don't know if there's like a better industry word for this, but like when I was trying to normalize a field, I would just start with the most common situation and try to match against like a regular expression or something like that. And then, if it matches, great. If it doesn't, you tumble down to the second most common situation. And you can just do this repetitively, right? If you fail every time you get to the bottom of the tumble, you have an uncaught situation there. You can go back and code for whatever wasn't caught, and then just keep going. So a lot of this, is designed around just kind of building the thing progressively, and then debugging by failure, right? Like, have a lot of print statements, run until you get something unexpected, and then quit, and just kind of move progressively through the program. That to me is like, because I don't have a great technical understanding of Python, made it sort of easy to just sort of build things until they work and then move on. Just a little bit on the mapping and the translation of this document. There are a few kind of quirks. You can see in the sort of third column from the left there that the date of accession is encoded as just month and day, which is fine if you're a human, because you can just look at the first column there and see that the year was 1988. But it's not great if you're the computer, because the computer doesn't read the whole thing as a whole. It's just reading one part of it. So I say this only to demonstrate that sometimes you have to do things that are slightly more complex than just take data from one field and put it in one other, corresponding place in ArchivesSpace. This is particularly true in the red circle. There is how ACMaster encodes extents, which is this really helpful 0.5R thing. What that means is 1/2 of a record storage carton. But that's pretty unclear. And also there were like 17 different letters that were in use to denote different form of media or type of box or whatever, anything to indicate size. So I ended up having to construct a pretty big and annoying lookup table to do this. This was by far the hardest part, I think, that and getting all of the dates correct. But this just to say that there's a sort of varying complexity to actually unpacking data from something like this and making it useful in a destination system. This is just to kind of show how the mapping eventually worked. It's not really important to this presentation that you understand how, just to see that most of the data from ACMaster is being used, and a lot of it is being kind of recombined in several parts into construct one usable field for what happens in ArchivesSpace. And that, I think, is what really sort of makes Python shine as a way to do this. So I promised not to show a bunch of code. I just thought it would be helpful to have an example of the tumble down logic that I was talking about. This is a function designed to normalize material dates. So you can see in each one of these sections, we're matching against a regular expression. And I have this sort of marked up on the next slide here. So each rung on the ladder we drop down, we're looking for a less common situation. So first we start and catch normal spans, and then process those however we need to get them into ArchivesSpace, and then we catch a single date, right, and process that however we need, and then and you just sort of go down the line. And then when if you run the entire column through the program and nothing falls out at the end, you've caught every situation, and you'll be able to process all of that data at runtime. So the next step is to then encode everything as JSON, which is, of course, well, I don't know about of course, but it's pretty simple. There's a little bit of logic going on here where we have to make sure that we're getting the extents and the dates right and stuff like that. But mostly it's really just sticking the stuff that with the variables we've already processed into a JSON form. Simple stuff. And this is my favorite part, because ArchiveSnake just sort of does all the work. At the beginning of this process, I thought that this would be the hardest thing. I didn't have a lot of experience working with APIs or scripting against them. And by the end of the project, it was this was the easiest part. It took 10 minutes to implement this, because ArchiveSnake just makes everything so easy. If you're working with the API at all and you're not, I would highly recommend taking a look at this because anyway, like you can see, this is the entire part of the script that interacts with the API. So that's nice and simple. Here's an example of the result. This is the same data from the line I was breaking down before. It's pretty sparse for an ArchivesSpace accession record, but it's the data in here is good. You know, you've like a full title, you got some sort of content description where the thing, what record group the thing ended up in, a provenance statement, and then of course structured dates and extents the way that ArchivesSpace likes them. So it's pretty well structured data. Two things that I wanted to point out about this that I'll talk about in my sort of takeaways are, one, in the title, I chose to append to the title of all of these things this little tag that says ACMaster on them, which in my mind makes it clear to everyone what they're looking at when they look at this record. I tried to make this as easy of a process for staff when they start using this data as possible. So just indicating that they're looking at a record that was generated programmatically, I think is useful. And I put it in the title so that it would show up in the search results, in the search index. So when things come up, you'll know that you're looking at a bunch of things and some of them came in programmatically from this document that we previously used. The other thing is that down in the general note, at the end of the process, and this is one of the reasons I tried to stay away from making any changes to the source data, was that I could then at the end take all of the fields as they originally came in, kind of stick them together as pairs around a pipe character, and then drop that in the general note so that the user has ready access to whatever the original data was in ArchivesSpace, unless anything screwy happened with the mapping or in case something is confusing. So as a result of the project, we now have 9,000 new accession records in ArchivesSpace. That's about 20 times what we had before because we had only been entering new ones into ArchivesSpace. So that's obviously like a large increase in the coverage of our collection. It reduced at least by one the number of resources that we had to use for description because this has completely replaced ACMaster as a way to get at this data and a way to update it. The migrated accessions can now be linked to resources. So like this has changed at least a little bit the like way that we have processing workflows. It's much easier now to like detect when there might be some bits and pieces that we will want to bring all together under one new identifier. It improves the clarity of provenance between those things. And it also just eliminates some duplicate labor where before we might have gone back and retroactively created an accession record in ArchivesSpace to store some sort of data. It's almost never going to be the case that we have to do that now. It's increased the visibility for what I would call legacy collections, or collections that are from before ArchivesSpace. At least internally, we don't have the external discovery function of ArchivesSpace enabled, but you know, for us internally, you can now do sort of fuzzy ArchivesSpace keyword searching against this like database of titles which you weren't able to do before. So it's I don't know, for me at least, it's much easier to search than using Control F in the access document. The majority of resources that are held by UW Archives should now be visible in ArchivesSpace. That's sort of a probable statement, again, because I don't know precisely what the Venn diagram between things that are in the electronic catalog and things that were in this database were. But it does mean that we have way more access via ArchivesSpace itself to collections going much farther back than we had before, at least at the title level. So that's just a really, really useful thing for us to have. So last bit here is just some quick lessons I thought that might be sort of generally applicable. Yes.
Let me send you have 2 more minutes. I just wanted to give you a warning.
I will zoom through this. So first thing is just to make sure that you have a proof of concept It helps to, get support from your supervisor and stuff like that if you can demonstrate that every chain or link in the chain will work. And then try to like anticipate the ways that the project will impact workplace functions. So having a sort of proof of concept lets you, have an example of maybe what resulting data will look like, and then you can more accurately predict what problems it might have and how it will affect what people are doing. This is my other sort of philosophical thing. Just try not to mutate the source data. Migrating things can decontextualize them. You can sometimes see things in the original data where you look at stuff that's next to other stuff, or where, maybe fields have been transposed vertically or horizontally, and they'll make sense to you looking at them, but then when you migrate them, they're taken out of that context, and so you might not be able to solve the same problem. So having respect for the source data, I think, can solve some of those problems, and solve complexity as opposed to add it. And then lastly, just always make it clear to the user what you're looking at. I tried to indicate how I was doing that on a previous slide. But I wanted the migrated data to be easy to distinguish. I wanted to give the viewer easy access to the original data. And then also I took out time to explain to everybody, how this process worked, what problems the migrated data might have, and how it might affect what they're doing, because it does have a certain impact on reference and processing work when you do something like this. So that's it. I don't know if there will be any time for questions, but no questions before I say thank you for listening. And here's my email address. I always want to hear about people's projects like this. Even if I can't, help you with your problems, I can at least hear about them.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tony. You said in the beginning you didn't know the audience here, but I got to say, you nailed it. That was really interesting. I'm sure there already are questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure that there are more. It's always really interesting to see how archivists are tackling problems. And I think the idea of like trying and failing really resonates with all of us, because that's a big part of our work now. So thank you so much for that presentation. We are right at time though. So instead of doing Q&A, what I'm going to ask